Hello. I'm Rachel, aka RaKoeRose. Welcome to my first video from May and June that I want to talk to you about. I have a Studio Ghibli screenshot redraw for you to watch. In May, the first book I read was Demon Slayer Volume 2 by Koyoharu Gorge. It's a really satisfying second book in this manga because I find very often that there's a very strong initial manga, but this one really kept the pace going where we can see Tanjiro progress as a demon slayer with a really high-speed, exhilarating storyline with lots of action, and Nezuko, of course, is still adorable and terrifying because she's very strong. I loved seeing how Gorge composed all of their fight scenes. They're very, very good at getting all of those compositions to look really cool, and then combining in like a sibling dynamic is just so wonderful. And it's also nice to see a hero in Tanjiro who doesn't feed into the idea that all of the enemies are bad. He thinks more critically and doesn't judge the entire group of demons because a few of them do bad things. It's overall a really fun manga, and I'm definitely gonna keep reading it at some point. I gave it 4 stars. After that, I read Vision, Volume 1, Little Worse Than a Man, and Volume 2, Little Better Than a Beast, written by Tom King and illustrated by Gabriel Hernandez Walta. It was a really interesting dive into something that I had always wondered about the character of Vision, which is what if he wasn't alone and wasn't the only one like him? And the family that he creates is so interesting with their dynamics because they all know that they're more unique than the humans around them because they were made and not born. And they always try so hard to be normal, and it's really understandable even as a human being, like, hey, sometimes you don't feel like you're very normal. And I really found myself wanting them to have like a good ending and wanting the best for them. There was actually a really interesting mystery during this series of graphic novels because there's all of these secrets that they're hiding because they're trying to keep everything looking normal. And so I really loved the style that this was drawn into. Like the colors in this series were immaculate. I loved looking at the layout and how it all looked. It was less of a heroic graphic novel for what Marvel makes and more gothic thriller almost. Raw and real to the struggles of a hero who really never asked to be a hero. And I gave both of those volumes 4 stars. Up next, I read Dune by Frank Herbert, which is one of the most well-known science fiction books of all time, ever. And so I knew that I had to get to it eventually, and with quarantine happening, I was like, what better time to read a tome of a science fiction novel? Herbert is a very descriptive writer. He reveals not very much point blank, and you have to look through immense subtext just to understand the intricacies of the characters that he writes and the politics and the world they're in. I like this style, but I can totally see how it wouldn't be for everyone, but I've read 60s sci-fi before, and I knew what to expect going into this. But if it's not for you, you totally shouldn't feel pressured to read this book just because it's a classic, you know? The book opens with Paul Atreides, son of the Duke Atreides, enduring an intense pain test, and things only pick up and get faster and faster and faster from there, where the action just kind of never ends, and you end up watching him from when he's 15 to his early 20s, where he's become a really interesting leader and more wise and more everything, really. If you don't really like fantasy politics, I really don't think this book would be for you also, because I love politics in fiction and learning the intricacies of the system of Arrakis where they live. And if you don't like trying to figure out who's in charge, who's doing what, why they're doing different things, it's not going to be as fun. Paul and Chani, though, are adorable, and I can't wait to reread this book just to see them together again because they're very wholesome and cute. I gave this 4 stars again. It was a very 4-star time. After that, I read Allegion by Stephen King, which is a very short novella almost about a man who's losing weight without seeming to change in physical appearance. And it had a side story to it of a sapphic couple and their struggles living in this small town that's very sheltered and closed and conservative. And then also the main plot line of Scott, the main man, dealing with this internal crisis of losing all this weight and not knowing what's going to happen. I didn't mind this book, but I also know that it's not one that's going to stick with me for a really long time, like some of King's other works that I've read. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. Then I read Persephone by, forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, I believe it is a French name, Loic Locatelli-Koinski. I apologize. It's a graphic novel reimagining of the Persephone fairy tale that's more heavily focused on the relationship between Persephone and her mother, Demeter. The style of this graphic novel was amazing. I loved looking at almost every single panel and looking at the details. It felt almost like a Ghibli style, but rougher with more intensity. I loved seeing Demeter in this comic because she's so cool. She's a really interesting fighter with this bow mechanism that she uses. She's the kind of the witch of the town that she lives in who protects everybody. And it was a really interesting way to have the focus be less on a Hades and Persephone love story and more on a mother-daughter relationship that I really liked. So I gave this 4 stars. Up next is a new series that is already going to be a favorite, which is All Systems Red by Martha Wells, a novella following a self-named murder bot who has broken the regulation system, and instead of killing everybody around them, they just watch a lot of TV and get overly concerned about the humans that they're in charge of and wanting to protect. It's really more of a comedic sci-fi series that I really enjoy because it's lighthearted and more fun while also having really great characters. I also just have a soft heart for big, protective character types, and that's definitely what Murderbot is, where he's wanting to protect everybody, doesn't really understand why, doesn't know how he feels about living with humans and trying to work with them, despite them also not liking him. I'm genuinely mad I did not read this sooner because I've seen recommendations for it everywhere, so if you like sci-fi and you want a quick, fun read, I definitely recommend it. Of course, I ended up giving this one 5 stars. Next, I picked up the short 4-issue volume of Venus by Rick Levert and Huang Danlan. I picked it up on a whim without knowing much about it just because the cover looked interesting and the premise of it, where there's a colony headed to Venus and problems start happening. It was intriguing enough that I picked it up, and I'm not mad that I picked it up. And there was a really interesting focus on interplanetary politics where potential future debates with other planets are already being discussed, even though the people living on those planets really haven't even settled in yet. The thing is, though, the teammates in this series constantly got on each other's nerves, and while it was initially kind of funny and had a comedic charm to it, it got annoying really fast that it seemed like every 4 or 5 pages, some sort of argument was breaking out. And I really wish that this series had actually just been about Dr. Park, who is the funniest and most interesting of the teammates, in my opinion. He seemed to have the most intriguing background, too, so I wish this had more followed him getting there, how he got there, all that. But they fit as much as they could into a 4-issue run to make it worthwhile, and I still recommend it if you are interested in the premise. 3 stars. After that, I finished up a series that I've been reading recently, which I finished with Rebel Dawn by A.C. Crispin. It's the last book in a series following Han Solo and her other character, Bria Theron, as they attempt to dismantle a spice slave ring. I can't say much about this book without spoiling it, but I really liked this whole series, and I got it for like $3 at my library, and I'm not mad at that at all. There was really good dialogue in this book about how the Empire is a male-centric, almost misogynistic system among two really strong women characters that I loved seeing representation for, where they were both respected and upheld in their communities and acknowledging the faults of the other system, because I myself always look at Star Wars and I'm like, there's not a lot of women who are given roles of power that sustain them. There's just not very much representation for that, and I'm glad that this book tried to fix that a little bit. Chewbacca got married in this one, and it was adorable, and I loved it, and it's so wholesome and endearing. This series really focuses on hot politics, and even in this last book, it was still really engaging and interesting to learn about their different dueling rules and their different social and political criterias for being accepted in their group. And there was a really great finale last battle that obviously I'm not going to spoil what it was, but it was really good. I don't know. I love Star Wars. What more do you really want from me? I ended up giving this 4 stars. After Rebel Dawn, I ended up picking up Mooncakes, written by Suzanne Walker and illustrated by Wendy Zhu. I never know how to pronounce the X, I'm so sorry. Which is a graphic novel following a werewolf character and a witch character reconnecting as they've both grown up. It's a little bit queer, a little bit great with the representation. There was a really great mystery in the background that really kind of hit home the main themes of feeling accepted and loved in your own communities. Nova, the witch character, wears hearing aids, and it was so lovely to see that represented because I myself wear hearing aids. And seeing how they made the magic system work with her hearing loss and with her wearing hearing aids, it was so cool to see. Not many things ever discuss magic and disability kind of connected and intertwined like that. It was a fun, adorable LGBT plus read that I enjoyed immensely. I gave it 4 stars. I definitely want to reread it at some point for the warm fuzzies. Next, I read Howells Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, which is why the background is what you're seeing right now. I had only ever seen the Ghibli movie, so I was super excited to read this book, and I ended up reading it in a day. That's how into it I was. I really love fairy tale-esque stories, and this one is absolutely that. It's a new type of fairy tale with a different sort of premise, but the same lessons that fairy tales always tend to impart, where there's things about accepting yourself and learning to appreciate others, and it was just I loved seeing how many messages there were in this one story. And the plot itself was really engaging and made me want to see how Sophie and Howell's curses would end up for them. I already know I'll be rereading it in the future. It's a new favorite. I love it a lot. 5 stars. Absolutely. Up next, another new favorite series. I read Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. I had so much fun with this book. I love it so much. It follows a team dedicated to the research of a giant metal hand after it was found, and they have to connect it to other pieces. And it's told through a mix of interviews and personal journal entries, and I love mixed media or alternative format stories where things are told, especially more through a dialogue-heavy style. And the mystery interviewer that we never learn the name of became a favorite character, and I really loved almost all of the characters, and the drama, the action, the endless twists. It was so good. The ending of this book made me want to scream, and I think that's where I'll leave it. 5 stars. The last book in May was Cleopatra in Space Volume 1 by Mike Mayhack. I read this comic originally as a kid, back when it was still available as a webcomic online, and finding out that that website no longer works made me feel very old, even though I am not that old. But this whole series is a really fun take on bringing Cleopatra into the future and watching her adapt to her new surroundings. Kensu is a great guardian character over Cleo. He's one of the only characters looking out for her, and you can kind of feel that protective anger that she's being treated kind of forcefully despite not being allowed to adjust to her new surroundings. He's also a cat. Kensu is also a cat. It's great. I definitely want to keep reading this series because I didn't get very far when I first read it, and I want to see where Cleo goes. 4 stars for that one. Now we jump into the June books. I'm sorry this is long. Here we go. The first book in June was Be Prepared by Vera Brosco. It's a Russian name. I'm very sorry. It was a really great graphic novel, somewhat a memoir about how you can feel different and outcast as a child and struggle to find a place to fit in when you don't know how to find friends. It was also really fun to see Russian heritage displayed in this comic, where she goes to church and she goes and interacts with the Russian side of her heritage, because I don't see much of that, and I love seeing different cultures represented in graphic novels, and especially specifically children's fiction, which is what this is. I definitely would recommend this to kids. It's got lots of messages I think they would love. The style is fun and cute and would keep them engaged. I highly recommend this graphic novel. 4 stars. Then I read Blue Lily, Lily Blue by Maggie Stiefvater, which was a reread. I can't say much because it's the 3rd book in the series. I love the Raven Cycle and will probably reread it next year. Let's move on. I gave it 5 stars. Then I read The Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan. I'm experiencing Percy Jackson for the first time as an adult, and it makes me sad I didn't read them when I was younger because they were my sister's favorite, but I had stayed kind of away from it. But even as an adult, I still love Percy. He's a great character. I liked seeing Nico introduced in this one. The Hunters, who are kind of the main friends in this book, are super cool, and I loved Zoe. She's so rad. Themes of friendship and family are still at the forefront, and I absolutely adore that. I love when parents are brought into the story and can show love for their protagonist children, because very often I feel like protagonists in young adult novels and even children's novels are like, I don't have parents, or my parents aren't here for me, and I'm glad there's representation here of parents who are more involved. Overall, it's a magnificent series, and I'm forever glad that this series is still solid and great with representation after She Who Will Not Be Named ruined one of the other main series for kiddos. So I gave this 5 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and that's that. Up next, Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuvel. Oh, look, another book by the same author. If I pick up a sequel within 2 months, I probably love the series. I.e., I love this series, and in an event to avoid spoilers, all I will say is this book hurt me so much, but in like a good way. Ouch, Neuvel, why? I still love the personable comedy between interviewer and interviewee. 10-foot-tall robots are still cool. Can you tell I like Transformers yet? I like Transformers too. This book goes by lightning fast because it's primarily dialogue style, like it was before, and you just can't stop reading. 5 stars. It killed me. It decimated me. It was everything I never knew I wanted. After that, I read another Neuvel book, The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. I read this in one sitting. It was a really good tale of showing how systems relying on a simple pass-fail judgment with subjective testers can be a volatile system that's really not a good idea. It really thrives because of Neuvel's style of writing primarily dialogue, making everything non-stop, and you just can't look away as everything that happens in this novella happens. And I don't want to spoil anything more because I want everybody to be able to experience this book as I did, with very minimal background information, because it definitely makes it so you're more entranced by what's going on. I gave this one 4 stars. After The Test, I read Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGinnis, which I picked up kind of on a whim, but for all that is worthy, please look up trigger warnings or content warnings to this, because it is an intense survival story. Off the top of my head, I would offer warnings for gore, descriptions of pain, use of drugs, alcohol, etc. Like, it's visceral, gruesome, but very raw and very real feeling, and it feels almost like a memoir, because you can see Ashley thinking about her life as she spends endless time alone in the forest. So we get to see not just the present, but also how she got to be in the forest and why she likes the forest in the first place. Do I like survival stories now? We'll see. I definitely really like this one. 4 stars. After this, I read The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but I believe is a banned book. But it follows the main character, Sally, who is a woman of color. She's an African-American woman. And her very intense life growing up with abuse, being sent into a basically loveless marriage, and her realizations becoming more of a sapphic queer woman. Big content warnings for abuse, and I definitely recommend looking up other warnings if you need them for this one, because while the tone of it is very blunt and simply written, it is a little bit hard if you might have any sensitivity to it to read it. This book showcases multiple different Black women's experiences and struggles in life through the lens of Sally writing letters at first to God and then to her sister. I really didn't expect the sapphic and LGBT elements of this book. They were really nice to see, and I should have expected it based off of some of the alternative covers for this book, but it was so fun and so great to see, and a great dialogue on what it was like back then, not only being a Black woman, but also being a Black queer woman. It was a really great read and widened my scope of understanding and empathy, which is what books really should strive to do. It's a classic for a reason. I gave it 5 stars, highly recommend. After The Color Purple, I picked up The Deep by Rivers Solomon, which I picked up for the Juneteenth Blackathon, which I'm really glad I got this book put back on my radar for it. It's a gorgeous novella following a what-if fantasy sci-fi scenario where the children of pregnant Black slave women who were thrown from slaving ships live and create their own community underwater. And it was really great at showing the pain and hardship one goes through when you have such an intense past, and it's clearly a representation of generational pain and generational oppression. My only thing with this is I wish it had been longer. It's a very fantastic concept, and I really wish we had gotten to see more of it. I gave this 4 stars. Up next, we have, oh hey, another new favorite series, The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin. It's told through 3 different women at 3 different stages of life living as orogenies. I need to look up how to pronounce that next time. But they're individuals with the ability to wield the Earth's power who are dehumanized and brutalized for this innate ability of theirs. So, content warning for this one for child abuse. It got real intense. I definitely would warn you about that. But this book has a really neat magic system that's unlike almost anything I've ever seen before. I absolutely love learning about it over the course of this book. It's more geography-based, and I really like that. There's huge diversity representation, which I love to see. There are primarily Black, fantasy Black, but Black main characters. Lots of LGBT rep, and even the inclusion of a poly family that was really adorable to see and so cute. I grew attached to almost every character, which is very common when there are series that I really like. I usually like almost every single character. I was stunned by the ending and the reveals that N.K. Jemisin managed to weave into this. It's just all wonderful. Jemisin is a genius, and I'm so glad I read this, and I can't wait to read the next one. 5 stars. After this, I read Allegion by Veronica Roth, which was a reread to experience the Divergent series again after 7 years. The first portion of this book felt very slow compared to the first 2 in this series, kind of meh. A lot more teen angst than I expected, and I kind of got very annoyed at the communication difficulties between Triss and Tobias, because it felt like in every book they had some sort of conflict that was primarily based around them not knowing how to tell each other things. And you would think after maybe the second book they would be like, oh, we'll be more open and stick to it, but they're also shifting to 2 perspectives and points of views during this book was really off-putting and kind of weird to get into after being used to only reading Triss. But The ending of this series still hit really hard, but felt realistic because you can't put your life on the line so many times without consequence, with great notes about PTSD and grief and what going through something like what this book depicts would really impact you with. It still holds up okay, but I'm not nostalgia blind about this series. It's still, like, if you're interested, I would still recommend it, but 3 stars. Last book of June and the last book of this wrap-up, The Raven King by Maggie Stiefvater. What a surprise. We've already been over how much I love this series. I just want to hug all the characters, but I can't. As a second read-through, though, I found myself really liking the side characters and the new characters we're introduced to because I wasn't so focused on the main gang. And I have a new appreciation for the Gray Man, Declan, and Henry at the end of this reread. I'm sure I'll come back to reading about Henrietta at some point. I somehow managed to finish this reread on the same day I did 2 years ago, which is wild. And hey, at least now I can read Call Down the Hawk after putting it off until I did a reread. 5 stars. Thank you for listening to my opinions about books for the past half hour. If you like the art, maybe drop a like down below. If you agreed with some of my opinions, maybe drop me a comment. If you didn't agree with some of my opinions, definitely leave me a comment. I would like to know what you think as well. If you want to see more from me, feel free to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Bye!